France is marking the 10th anniversary of the Paris terror attacks by Islamic State Jihadists who killed more than 130 people and wounded hundreds more. Parisians laid wreaths at a candlelit vigil to pay their respects to the victims of France's worst terrorist incident. President Emmanuel Macron will lead more tributes at each attack site, beginning at the Stade de France Stadium and ending at the Bataclan concert venue where 90 people were shot dead. Let's take a look at how the events unfolded on that night in Paris 10 years ago.
Visitors and soccer players rushed to safety at the Paris Stadium. They'd heard explosions outside. 3 suicide bombers had detonated bombs around the stadium, killing several people. Shortly afterwards, police attended another scene of carnage. A gunman had opened fire on a crowded bar in central Paris. A significant security reaction failed to stop 3 more attacks across the city. The final attack sends music fans fleeing at a concert in the Bataclan Theatre. Gunmen had stormed in, firing randomly at the crowd. The so-called Islamic State militant group claimed responsibility. They had killed 130 people and injured many more. Just 4 months later, this, in the heart of Europe. 2 bombs in Brussels' Zaventem airport sent travelers and staff racing for safety. They hit Brussels' Malbec metro station too, right next to many of the EU institutions. They killed 32 people and injured hundreds more. Islamic State claimed responsibility. That summer, France again, on the country's National Day. The target, crowds in Nice who were watching the Bastille Day fireworks. Police shoot at the truck to stop the carnage. The man had driven into the crowd, mowing down people and continuing for 2 kilometers. The attack killed 86 people and injured over 400. It was also claimed by the Islamic State. 5 months later, another truck attack. This time in Berlin. It hit a Christmas market in the center of the city. The driver escaped to Italy, where he was killed in a shootout with police. The attack, also claimed by the Islamic State, killed 12 and injured many more. A further man died of his injuries 5 years later. Panic at an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, May 2017. The show had finished and people were starting to leave when a suicide attacker detonated a homemade bomb in the crowd. The attack, again claimed by the Islamic State. It killed 22 people and injured many more. In the following years, Islamist attacks became less frequent and less deadly, but they didn't disappear altogether.
And let's get more. We are joined by terrorism expert Joanna Cook. She is an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at Leiden University in the Netherlands and a senior project manager at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us. As we've been hearing, it's been 10 years since those Paris terror attacks. What do you think when you look back at that night, and what did it mean for Europe?
Yeah, I remember distinctly where I was at that event when the event took place, and it was an incredibly shocking period of time. The number of mass casualty and highly coordinated attacks conducted by Islamic State actors at that time. It was very traumatizing for Europe, and particularly for countries deeply affected like Germany, France, and then the UK. But I think what's quite important to note is that we have moved on quite a bit from that time. A lot has changed in the last 10 years. I mean, the time has flown by, but the situation is very, very different today than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's an important point to focus on a bit.
And as we've just heard, I mean, Islamist terror attacks have become much rarer and much smaller in scale, as you're referring to there. Is that the result of successful counter-terrorism work, or have the dynamics of militant Islamist extremism changed?
Yeah, there's several factors that are contributing to the decrease in attacks, and I think the most important one is the operational degradation of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So 10 years ago, they were at the peak of the caliphate. Their capabilities, their assets, the number of fighters they had available to coordinate mass casualty attacks was very, very high, and that has been severely degraded to the point where In the last year, for example, 4 Islamic State leaders were all targeted in Syria and taken out. We now see 10,000 Islamic State prisoners in northeast Syria detained. Many more were killed in that period. And we've seen a shift again from these highly centralized, targeted attacks to more lone actors and individual attacks carried out by persons across Europe. So every attack is a tragedy and should be the utmost should be done to prevent it. But if we look at the scale and particularly the scale of these types of attacks, they've decreased incredibly, and that's very important for Europe. And I think one thing to highlight as well is that there have been a great number of plots that have been foiled in the last year or so as well. So Europol recorded 19 plots foiled across Europe last year alone, which does suggest that counterterrorism investigations have been quite effective. But notably, there were also about 5 plots that were just unsuccessful. So those that were not, that were a mistake, there was luck alone that prevented them from taking place.
Okay. And I mean, you know, you've highlighted there that the so-called Islamic State has really lost a lot of influence and a lot of power. But ultimately, this ideology still exists. What threat
Correct.
do you see extremism posing today here in Europe?
Yeah, extremism it's much more complex than it was 10 years ago. So it was, in some ways, it was much simpler if somebody said that they were an adherent or a supporter of Islamic State. There was a clear membership to a terrorist organization or clear support for a distinct terrorist organization. And violent extremism has become a lot more complicated today. So we have seen several mass casualty attacks in Europe and the UK. In the last year or so, including Southport, where the ideological component was not explicit. So the types of attacks that have been taking place have become more complex and less easy to pinpoint. We've also seen, for example, the recent attack at the synagogue in Manchester. The individual, the perpetrator, he wasn't on a watch list. So we have had several cases as well of individuals who are simply not on the radar and haven't shown signs or been flagged up to authorities as risks. And those are very difficult. Those who act alone, lone actors, tend to be the most difficult to identify and intervene in advance of an attack.
Tell us a little bit more about how you see the situation now going forward. And in particular, I'm thinking about the unstable situation right now in the Middle East. Do you see it potentially provoking a new wave of terrorism?
Yeah. I think if we look at the Middle East, there's two key factors to keep in mind. So one, as long as Palestine and Israel, as long as there continues to be tension and conflict there, that will be used by some individuals as a motivation for them to conduct attacks. But the second thing I think that's quite important is if we look at Syria today, Syria was once there was a vacuum, a power vacuum when Assad was still in power, and there were areas of the country that were completely overtaken by Islamic State members. And we've seen again the government of al-Shara now take over, and though the country is still quite unstable, we have seen Syria sign up to the global coalition against Daesh and dedicate their country to the fight against Islamic State. So how that will unfold and what that will actually mean on the ground is yet to be seen, but it is an encouraging sign that the once stronghold of Islamic State, from which so many of these attacks in Europe also emanated from or were directed or inspired from, it does look like there is a positive move towards seeing that continue to be degraded and controlled in the region. But there are a whole host of ongoing factors. There are Islamic State families in camps in northeast Syria, Al Hol camp. We also see, for example, 10,000 prisoners related to Islamic State in northeast Syria alone. If a great number of those were to escape or be released from prison through an attack by Islamic State, as we have seen previously, that could be a cause for concern. But those are some of the factors that I think particularly related to the Middle East, we will have to keep an eye on.
Okay. And I'd like to also ask you, because, I mean, you did talk about the number of plots that have been foiled by counterterrorism authorities here in Europe, but ultimately, Europe's attention has really shifted. There are other glaring conflicts and crises. I'm thinking about, Russia, the situation in Ukraine, for example. How do you see the danger of complacency about jihadist terrorism returning potentially?
I think that's a great point, and it is important to remember that in terms of terrorism watch lists, jihadist terrorists remain on the top of the list for almost every country in Europe, several countries in Europe, I should say. There are others like Greece and Italy where that's a bit different. But for countries like Germany, the UK, France, jihadist terrorism is without question one of the biggest ongoing threats. And again, largely related to individual perpetrators and people who've already been identified and on watch lists. However, I think, again, one of the other points to keep in mind is that because of this shift to other issues, ongoing warfare in places like Ukraine, great power politics, a whole host of other issues kind of taking attention away from the issue of terrorism, we have seen a reduction in both financing and focus on prevention of violent extremism across Europe and the funding and support for that. So the effect of that is yet to be seen, but it is an area that I think is incredibly important to continue to focus on and develop. The prevention of violent extremism is as important as the more harsh counterterrorism measures taken afterwards as well. We do want to try and prevent these types of actions and recruitment and radicalization of individuals as much as we want to intervene when plots are being developed.
Terrorism expert Joanna Cook, thank you so much for joining us to share those insights.
Thank you.
Hans-Jakob Schindler is Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. That's a non-profit, non-partisan international think tank working to combat the threat posed by extremist ideologies. He joins us from New York City. Welcome back to DW. How big a threat is Islamist terrorism to Europe now?
Well, it remains a very complex threat environment. We have several drivers for that threat. One is, of course, the still ongoing conflict in the Middle East. The other one, not quite as recognized publicly, is the fact that big Islamist terrorist organizations like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have been doing very well in the last couple of years, both in the Middle East, but also in Africa, in particular, West and East Africa, where we have several countries now at danger to be taken over by either Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State in the next couple of months. So there is a victory narrative from this milieu that feeds into the already accelerated radicalization narrative through the Middle East conflict. And then, of course, we have a social media environment, which, as far as radicalization of any kind is concerned, is pretty much out of control. All of this means there is going to be a continuing, very complex threat environment from Islamist terrorism, but also violence from other extremist ideologies as well.
It's interesting you say that part of their narrative is victory in the Middle East, when the accepted wisdom has been that the whole idea of jihad, an Islamist empire has been stamped out and they're sort of dissipated. So why do you say that despite that, they're still talking about victory?
Look, I mean, first of all, in 2024, the Islamic State was able to do more attacks in Syria than in the period 2019 to 24 combined. In 25 is going to be broken. They are going to have more attacks in Syria than they had in 2024. Then we have a situation in Afghanistan where it's back under the management of the Taliban, the same individual Taliban that were thrown out of Kabul in 2002 with the exact same relationship with Al-Qaeda than they had until 2002. So the narrative is we defeated the international community in Afghanistan. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab is close to the capital Mogadishu, and it's not clear how long the capital is going to hold. So it is about to take over parts of Somalia. In Mali, the Al-Qaeda coalition Jinim is surrounding the capital of the country, Bamako, for a couple of weeks already, and it's unclear how long the military regime can hold, while it's also controlling about 65% of Burkina Faso, and the Islamic State is operating quite freely inside Nigeria right now. So everywhere you look outside of Europe, Islamic terrorist organizations, unfortunately, are doing very well.
Right. OK, thanks for that fascinating, if somewhat frightening, analysis. Talk to us about the situation here in Europe, where the number of coordinated spectaculars, if I can put it that way, as we saw in 2015 to 17, that's dropped off. But we are still seeing radicalised individuals carrying out attacks like the Duisburg knife attack here in Germany and last year's Southport knife attack. So the threat is evolving as well.
Yes, it's changing, partly because there was a strategic change on how to do terrorism by the Islamic State 2 years after the Bataclan attack. In 2017, the Islamic State officially put out a statement that said, please don't come anymore, don't join the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, it's too dangerous to travel, you're going to get arrested on the way most likely, but stay home and do whatever you can, and then produced a couple of instructional videos on how to do a car attack, how to do an attack with explosives, and how to do an attack with a knife. And the perpetrator of the horrible terror attack in Solingen last year actually paradigmatically implemented that instructional video in the way that he did his attack in Solingen. So this material is still having a very much real-world effect. But also, we now have a far more aggressive social media environment with the new version of the algorithms actually facilitating and accelerating and deepening radicalization, which also means we now no longer just have individuals adhering to the Islamic State or other terror groups like Hamas. We have individuals out of a general Islamist terrorist ideology, what experts call salad bar ideologies, that combines narratives from various ideological strands perpetrating attacks. So we have also a much broader group of individuals that are dangerous as far as violence is concerned.
So there's that. And there's also Israel's war in Gaza. And between that and the war in Ukraine, Europe has been preoccupied as well as with the rise of the far right. Is there a worry that jihadi terrorism could actually fall off the radar over here?
Well, unfortunately, it has, of course, not been at the center of the discussions for the reasons that you just outlined. The biggest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War going on in Ukraine, and, of course, the very serious situation in the Middle East. Ironically, the situation in the Middle East, the slightly calmer situation in Gaza, may actually increase the risk of Hamas trying to do international terror attacks. We just had, over the last couple of weeks, starting in October, the arrest of several Hamas individuals that were trying once again, and this is the second time in less than 2 years. The first group was arrested in December 2023 in Berlin, trying to do this more classical terror attacks of coordinated attacks of several individuals with arms or explosives. So we still see this going on. And Hamas has already said before this recent deal was signed by the parties that they are present in Jerusalem, but in the West, also in the West Bank, but also internationally. And that internationally should be understood somewhat as a threat that Hamas, if it is giving up weapons and power in Gaza as part of this process, they're not there yet, but they may get there, that it will prove its value and its power as an organization, not only through an increased terror attack in Israel, but also to, for the first time ever, and we had 2 attempts that luckily failed, terrorist attacks in the West, including in Europe.
OK, thanks for guiding us through that so clearly, Hans-Jakob. Hans-Jakob Schindler from the Counter-Extremism Project.
Thank you so much.